treffen. Ich will allen helfen, die krank sind.
Ich möchte Kindern zeigen, wie man neue Dinge lernt und dabei ganz viel lacht.
Wenn ich mal groß bin, hoffe ich, dass ich mag, was aus mir geworden ist.
Unsere Gesellschaft von morgen entscheidet sich heute. www.soskinderdorf.de
That morning, checking the exact same cracks I'd reported. He ran his hand along the fracture lines and shook his head, and then 10 minutes later, the video showed him on a conference call telling investors conditions were perfect. Marcus said his camera was supposed to be off, but it wasn't. I copied the footage to 3 different drives, while Marcus sat on my couch drinking the coffee I made. The next morning, the Denver journalist called me saying her story was going live in an hour. When it posted online, 3 families from Blaze resorts in Utah and Wyoming came forward with their own stories about suppressed avalanche warnings and threatened employees and 2 people who died in preventable slides. The story got picked up by national outlets within hours, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with interview requests. The day after that, a lawyer from Denver showed up at my apartment with a stack of papers saying she was taking our case pro bono. She sat at my kitchen table explaining that Blake's insurance company was already backing away because they don't cover criminal negligence. She filed subpoenas for 10 years of resort communications before she even finished her coffee. Tommy came over that afternoon, and I showed him Marcus's helmet footage for the first time. He watched himself and Carmen getting on the lift while the mountains started breaking apart above them. When the timestamp showed they were 15 seconds from being directly in the slide path, he whispered that if they'd been any later, they would have died. He threw up in my bathroom and then sat on the floor for 20 minutes. Blake called an emergency board meeting the next day, but someone recorded the whole thing on their phone. The audio leaked within hours, showing board members talking about liability mitigation and narrative control, but never once mentioning the 11 people who died. The recording went viral on Twitter and Reddit, with people calling for criminal charges. Resort employees started texting me privately after that. The head of lift operations admitted Blake ordered him to keep the summit lift running even after he raised safety concerns. He said he had 4 kids, but couldn't live with what happened anymore. More employees reached out with similar stories about Blake threatening their jobs if they reported problems. Rachel brought 5 other families to my apartment the next evening. They sat in my living room sharing photos of their kids and spouses who died in the avalanche. Tommy listened to every story and realized he was the only adult who survived being completely buried. He told them he had to speak for everyone who couldn't. 2 days later, I was buying milk at the grocery store when Blake appeared with a camera crew. He shoved a microphone in my face, demanding to know how it felt to destroy hundreds of jobs. I stayed calm and asked him how it felt to value profit over 11 lives. The video split our town, with some people supporting Blake and others finally admitting they knew something was wrong. I drove to the mountain the next morning and found flowers and photos and crossed ski holes growing into a memorial at the base. Someone left a note that said they knew the truth, and some of them always knew. Resort security kept removing items, but people kept bringing more flowers and photos and candles. 2 days after that, FBI agents showed up at the resort with search warrants. They loaded servers and computers and boxes of records into trucks, while Blake's lawyer stood there calling it a witch hunt but couldn't stop it. The agents also searched Blake's house and his office and took 20 years of documents. Local news filmed the whole thing with Blake standing in his driveway yelling about government overreach while agents carried evidence boxes past him. The insurance company filed their lawsuit 2 days later, claiming Blake knew about the danger and hid it from everyone. Their lawyers found proof that Blake bought extra insurance just 2 days before the avalanche happened. The filing said 3 words that made my stomach drop. He knew everything. Tommy had to give his testimony from his hospital bed with machines beeping around him and an oxygen mask on his face. The lawyers set up cameras and Tommy described being buried alive while Blake's lawyers kept trying to stop him from talking. He said it felt like being trapped in concrete and knowing he was going to die right there. Blake's lawyers objected 17 times, but the judge on the video call let Tommy keep going. Dr. Hayes called me 2 days later and said he was fixing his official report to include those 12 minutes the security guards wasted. He knew Blake might get him fired, but he couldn't live with lying about what really happened that day. The town meeting on day 58 turned into chaos when one of Blake's own investors stood up and demanded answers about geology reports. Blake started screaming about ungrateful parasites living off his mountain, and everyone saw who he really was. 2 nights later, families of the victims held a candlelight vigil at the community center downtown. Half the town showed up, even though Blake had threatened to fire anyone who went. I stood there with hundreds of candles glowing, and for the first time since the avalanche, I didn't feel completely alone. The state pulled the resort's operating license the next morning, and Blake's emergency injunction got denied by the judge. She said public safety was more important than profit, and the resort closed for the first time in 40 years. Blake's former assistant found me outside the courthouse and handed me a flash drive with 2 years of recordings. She had audio of Blake talking to investors about acceptable casualty rates and calculating that lawsuits would cost less than closing. Her hands shook as she told me she'd been waiting for the right time to share what she knew. Tommy called me from the hospital 2 days later, and Carmen was crying in the background. He'd just walked 10 feet from his bed to the chair without any help from the nurses. The doctor had said he might never walk again, but Tommy was determined to walk into court on his own. The FBI discovered Blake had been moving money to offshore accounts since the day of the avalanche. They froze everything they could find, but millions were already gone, and his lawyer quit the case. I went back to the mountain on day 70 and stood where the avalanche started, looking at the new warning signs. The mountain didn't care about any of our human drama or Blake's greed or the lawsuits. It just existed the way mountains do, but we had chosen to ignore what it was telling us. 2 days later, I got a call from someone on the resort board saying they were voting to fire Blake that afternoon. I drove to the resort and saw news vans already setting up in the parking lot. The board meeting was supposed to be private, but word had gotten out somehow. I waited outside the main office building with about 50 other people, including families from the avalanche. After 3 hours, someone came out and said Blake was officially terminated, but he wouldn't leave his office. Through the windows, we could see him at his desk with 2 private security guards blocking the door from inside. The state police showed up with 6 officers who went upstairs while we all watched from outside. 20 minutes later, they came back down with Blake in handcuffs, and his face was bright red with anger. The photographers got their shots as the cops walked him to their car, and by that night, his arrest photo was on every news website. 2 days after that, the town council held public hearings at the town hall about what to do with the resort. I sat in the back row listening to families talk about how they'd been scared to speak up for years because Blake controlled so many jobs in town. The mayor stood up and said Blake had held the whole town hostage with money and threats. Marcus showed up at my apartment on day 76 with 3 other patrollers I knew from the mountain. They were starting their own independent safety company and wanted me as an advisor even without my credentials. Marcus said they'd never let management override safety calls again, no matter what. 2 days later, I was eating breakfast when the news broke that Blake had been arrested on federal charges. The list was long, including criminal negligence and wire fraud and conspiracy, and 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter. His new public defender looked like a kid fresh out of law school standing next to him at the arraignment. The man who used to own half the town now had nothing but a court-appointed lawyer. The grand jury met 2 days after that and indicted Blake plus 3 board members who had known about the suppressed safety reports. Officer Davis called me that afternoon to say my documentation had saved the whole case, and they had enough for consecutive life sentences. Tommy came over on day 82, and we sat on my couch watching old skiing videos from when we were kids. He said he didn't blame me for what happened, and that he blamed himself for not listening, and Blake for everything else. We didn't hug, but something changed between us that day. Rachel was organizing the families to file civil suits against Blake personally on day 84, and her lawyers had found a way to pierce the corporate protection. Her daughter Emma was there in her wheelchair, missing 3 toes from frostbite, and Rachel said Blake didn't get to hide behind the resort anymore. Then Blake's wife filed for divorce and got a restraining order 2 days later. She gave investigators recordings she'd been making for years of Blake talking about moving money offshore if things went bad. The recordings had him planning escape routes and talking about which countries didn't have extradition treaties. The resort reopened on day 88 under new management with the strictest safety rules in the country. I stood at the base watching families come back, but most kids who were there during the avalanche wouldn't go near the slopes. Parents held their children's hands tighter, and some families just came to look at the mountain, then left without skiing. The trauma was spreading through generations, and you could see it in how people moved differently on the mountain now. 2 days later, prosecutors called me to their office downtown to prepare for testimony. They had boxes stacked to the ceiling with 400 hours of recordings and 10,000 documents and 60 witnesses ready to testify. The lead prosecutor showed me Blake's own emails where he documented every safety violation and cover-up thinking he was protecting himself legally. She said it was the strongest case she'd seen in 20 years, and Blake had basically documented his own crimes. 2 weeks passed before the FBI called with news that made my stomach drop. They'd been digging into Blake's past and found something nobody expected. The agent showed me documents from a mine collapse in Montana 15 years ago. Different name back then, Robert Harrison, but same face in the photos. Same pattern too. Safety inspector warned about unstable tunnels, and Robert Harrison fired him. 23 miners died when the main shaft collapsed.